Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Staś Butler. All eyes are on Taiwan as its next presidential election lies just around the corner. The ruling Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, just confirmed its vice president pick as Xiaobi Kim, who's been Taiwan's de facto ambassador to the US for the past 3 years. It's seen as a way of reassuring Washington that a Lai presidency would not destabilize ties with China, which claims Taiwan and views Lai and his party as separatists. Meanwhile, Taiwan's main opposition parties, the Kuomintang and Taiwan People's Party, both have platforms based on repairing ties with Beijing, which cut communication with Taipei when Tsai Ing-wen became president. But another major factor here is the competition between China and the US, which is Taiwan's main unofficial ally. To find out how this might be affecting the election, I spoke to Chong Ja Ian, a non-resident scholar at Carnegie China. But before looking at geopolitics, we first zoom in on why the ruling DPP seems to be losing the local youth vote.
So I think incumbency, for one thing, changes people's minds. The fact that there are continuing problems with the housing prices, and also the fact that for younger people, their incomes have not risen. So I think that's created a lot of frustration with the DPP among younger voters. There's also the perception that the DPP, because it's been around for so long and been in office for so long, is much more aligned with business interests rather than regular younger people.
And how much of a problem is that for Lai Ching-te, the DPP's candidate?
So it is a problem for Lai. I think he would probably appreciate more younger voters. But he seems, for right now, barring any unforeseen circumstances, the most serious of the candidates in terms of experience, in terms of what he's able to bring. So I think that's one reason why he's still leading in most opinion polls. But that's probably coming from various other places rather than the youth vote. But I think the larger problem is not so much the presidential race, it's the legislative races where the youth vote and getting less well-known people and people who are associated with the DPP into office, that's going to be more of an issue.
Moving to the issues that's going to be driving people to vote, in 2020, we had the Hong Kong protests that, it seemed to be that the issue of China and Hong Kong and Taiwan was driving people to the ballot in that vote. How much of an issue is China going to be in this time around?
Part of that is up to China, up to the PRC, depending on how they decide to put pressure on Taiwan and on Taiwanese voters. But I think many people who, especially observers outside Taiwan, seem to think that everything is driven by cross-strait issues. Cross-strait issues are important, but it's not the only thing. The economy, for younger people, income, housing, those things matter. There's issues of for young families, support for childcare. There's a whole bunch of issues that make Taiwanese voters really like voters anywhere else.
You mentioned kind of what China, perhaps wants out of this election, but what does the US want to see from this election?
You're right that the PRC probably wants policies to be more Beijing-leaning. For the United States, I think what they really want is continuity. They want a government, so this would be both the executive and legislative branches, that is steady, that is stable, that pulls no surprises in any direction, and is a reliable partner. Of course, that raises the question of US domestic politics as well, and how reliable the United States is. But at least in terms of dealing with Taiwan, consistency, predictability on the sort of larger direction would be important.
How much continuity do you think we will see? Because the parties talk about taking Taiwan in perhaps a different direction, but is a change of government really going to change things?
So there are a couple of things to note. One is when we talk about the economic issues, I think none of the parties are going to be fundamentally different, including the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, because to be able to be competitive, to be able to run expensive campaigns. They need donations, and many of these donations are tied to commercial interests. And those interests, they like or they thrive even in the current environment in Taiwan. So some of those youth issues I talked about, there's less incentive to deal with them, regardless of the talk. Beyond that, I think if you're looking at the Taiwan-China relationship, there is a big, almost consensus in Taiwan. If you look at various polling, basically, about 80+% of Taiwanese want the status quo in some way, shape, or form, regardless of what ultimate status Taiwan takes. And so that means that even though there is increasing Taiwanese identity, which is not necessarily tied to any political party, there is recognition that maintaining the current state of affairs is key. So any political party that deviates from that path, whether in a more obviously pro-independence, actively pro-independence fashion, or one that is too close to the PRC, will get punished by the voters. We saw this with Ma Ying-jeou in 2014. That's what happened. He decided to make a pitch to get closer to the PRC that deviated from the understanding that Taiwanese voters want. And that sort of 80+% is very consistent over years. And they punished him and his party.
All of the major candidates have visited the US to essentially kind of show that they're committed to, at least in some shape or form, maintaining that relationship. The US has dealt with a DPP administration. It's dealt with a KMT administration. How do you think they feel about Chong Ja, a candidate from a new party that they haven't really dealt with before?
So officially, I think the US won't sort of have anything to say. They will engage all the different parties and try to figure out what their positions are. But I think dealing with Ke, whether you are a domestic voter or if you're a foreign observer, the question of his own consistency is a bit of a question. He has a tendency to say one thing at one moment and go to another. Some people call it flexibility, but others may see that as lacking in commitment, lacking in direction. So it's up to Ke to make a pitch, a stronger and clearer pitch that he has some values that ground him, rather than just what some would say is political opportunism, what others might claim is a willingness to experiment and depart from the blue and green debate, which in itself, I guess that's a certain appeal to younger voters, but that's just a slogan. There has to be some sense of how that difference is going to be manifested.
What would China like to see come out of this election? And how much power do they actually have to bring about that outcome?
So for the PRC, the point is to have a Taiwanese administration that is more amenable to its interests, meaning to say a willingness to accept its version of the One China principle, which is different from others, including actually from the ROC constitution. It would like acceptance of the slogans that it's put out, one country, two systems, 92 consensus as defined by the one country, two systems. That's in general. I think they would also prefer if there is a administration, this is executive branch, that is perhaps less pliant, then at least a legislature that is able to block the initiatives of that executive. Of course, in an ideal world, they would want to have a legislature and an executive that leans towards Beijing, something like what you might see in Hong Kong.
But, we talk about kind of Chinese influence in elections, often in quite vague terms. And if they are looking for an administration that's perhaps not the current one, the DPP, that they've made they have not hidden their distaste for that administration. Is it working? Is what they're doing working since the DPP is still leading in those polls?
Right, so I think the presidential race, right now, there's some frustration that the opposition parties can't get together. I think there is the possibility, or people would reasonably suspect, that there's some pressure to push for some opposition unity coming from the PRC. I think that might be what the investigations onto Foxconn are about. So you get Terry Goh to drop out of the race, and so you have the opposition vote being less split, more consolidated, more higher vote share. I suppose the other thing to look out for beyond the election are efforts to reach out to civil society, other political groups, to see whether there can be some sort of coordination with the CCP on the mainland in the way that we sort of saw with business groups and so on in Hong Kong in years past.
You mentioned Terry Goh and the investigation into Foxconn. Since that point, he's been quite silent on the campaign trail. He's not polling particularly well. Is his race over, or can he turn this around?
I suppose it depends on how he wants to handle the Foxconn situation. I suppose it hits his pocketbook very directly. It also shows, in fact, highlights the risks of having a candidate whose interests are so tied to the PRC. Or in fact, it doesn't have to, it can be any outside entity, right? They can be more easily pressured. Now, in terms of what Terry Goh can do, I suppose if he has a clean break with Foxconn, sells his shares and becomes less fluent, he can make an argument to say that, look, I'm really serious. And I really think that I want to bring Taiwan forward. He may be able to boost his numbers. Whether it's enough to get him to win, I don't know. But that's something that's possible. But to show that he is susceptible to Beijing's pressure, I think doesn't help his poll numbers.
And how do you see this election panning out?
If we project directly from what we know now, it's very likely that the DPP will retain the presidency. But the key, again, will be legislative yuan. Given what we talked about earlier in terms of the DPP's lack of appeal, more broadly, what we could see then is they'd probably likely lose their majority in the legislative yuan. So the question is, how many seats would they fall short of a majority? If it's just a few seats, I suppose they could look for some independents. It might be easier for them to cross that majority, to pass budgets, to pass laws. If they fall short by quite a bit, then there may be questions about their need to depend on, say, the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, to get them to cross the line, and then Ko-Wen-Ze and the TPP would be in a position not just to consolidate their position for future elections, but also to, in order to do that, right, they are able to make serious demands on the DPP. And I suppose having two bigger opposition parties means that there's some possibility for the DPP to play the TPP against the KMT and vice versa. But I don't know, I guess it depends on what a DPP presidency can offer, because the KMT, given the way that they've positioned themselves today, they seem quite ideologically opposed to the DPP, and to get real substantive longer-term cooperation might be difficult. Maybe on specific issues it could be possible, and that's just, it depends on whatever issue comes up.
That was Carnegie China's non-resident scholar Chong Ja Ian speaking on how competition between the US and China will affect Taiwan's presidential election. And this has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.